And because they kept marching, America changed. Because they marched, a civil rights law was passed. Because they marched, a voting rights law was signed. Because they marched, doors of opportunity and education swung open so their daughters and sons could. Finally imagine a life for themselves beyond washing somebody else's laundry or shining somebody else's shoes. Because they marched, city councils changed and state legislatures changed. And Congress changed, and, yes, eventually, the White House changed. Because they marched, America became more free and more fair not just for African Americans, but for women and Latinos. Asians and Native Americans, for Catholics, Jews, and Muslims, for gays, for Americans with a disability. America changed for you and for me. And the entire world drew strength from that example. Whether the young people who watched from the other side of an iron curtain and would eventually tear down that wall. Or the young people inside South Africa who would eventually end the scourge of apartheid. Those are the victories they won, with iron wills and hope in their hearts. That is the transformation that they wrought, with each step of their well-worn shoes. That's the debt that I and millions of Americans owe those maids, those laborers, those porters. Those secretaries, folks who could have run a company maybe if they had ever had a chance. Those white students who put themselves in harm's way, even though they didn't have, those Japanese Americans who recalled their own internment. Those Jewish Americans who had survived the Holocaust, people who could have given up and given in. but kept on keeping on, knowing that weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. On the battlefield of justice, men and women without rank or wealth or title or fame would liberate. Us all in ways that our children now take for granted. As people of all colors and creeds live together and learn together and walk together, and fight alongside one another, and love one another. And judge one another by the content of our character in this greatest nation on earth. To dismiss the magnitude of this progress, to suggest, as some sometimes do, that little has changed that dishonors the courage and the sacrifice of those who paid the price to march in those years. Medgar Evers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner. Martin Luther King Jr. They did not die in vain. Their victory was great. But we would dishonor those heroes as well to suggest that the work of this nation is somehow complete. The arc of the moral universe may bend towards justice, but it doesn't bend on its own. To secure the gains this country has made requires constant vigilance, not complacency. Whether by challenging those who erect new barriers to the vote, or ensuring that the scales of justice work equally for all, and the criminal justice system is not simply a pipeline from underfunded schools to overcrowded jails, it requires vigilance. And will suffer the occasional setback. But we will win these fights. This country has changed too much. People of goodwill. Regardless of party, are too plentiful for those with ill will to change history's currents. In some ways, though, the securing of civil rights, voting rights. The eradication of legalized discrimination. The very significance of these victories may have obscured a second goal of the march. For the men and women who gathered 50 years ago were not there in search of some abstract ideal. They were there seeking jobs as well as justice, not just the absence of oppression but the presence of economic opportunity. For what does it profit a man, Dr. King would ask, to sit at an integrated lunch counter if he can't afford the meal? This idea that one's liberty is linked to one's livelihood, that the pursuit of happiness requires the dignity of work. The skills to find work, decent pay, some measure of material security. This idea was not new. Lincoln himself understood the Declaration of Independence in such terms as a promise that in due time, the weights should be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have an equal chance. And Dr. King explained that the goals of African Americans were identical to working people of all races. Decent wages, fair working conditions, livable housing, old age security, health, and welfare measures. Conditions in which families can grow, have education for their children, and respect in the community. What King was describing has been the dream of every American. It's what's lured for centuries new arrivals to our shores. And it's along this second dimension of economic opportunity. The chance through honest toil to advance one station in life where the goals of 50 years ago have fallen most short. Yes, there have been examples of success within black. America that would have been unimaginable a half-century ago. But as has already been noted, black unemployment has remained almost twice as high as white unemployment. Latino unemployment close behind. The gap in wealth between races has not lessened, it's grown. And as President Clinton indicated, the position of all working Americans, regardless of color, has eroded, making the dream Dr. King described even more elusive. For over a decade, working Americans of all races have seen their wages and income stagnate. Even as corporate profits soar, even as the pay of a fortunate few explodes. Inequality has steadily risen over the decades. Upward mobility has become harder. In too many communities across this country. In cities and suburbs and rural hamlets, the shadow of poverty casts a pall over our youth. Their lives a fortress of substandard schools and diminished prospects, inadequate health care and perennial violence. And so as we mark this anniversary, we must remind ourselves that the measure of progress for those who marched 50 years ago was not merely how many blacks could join the ranks of millionaires. It was whether this country would admit all people who are willing to work hard regardless of race into the ranks of a middle-class life. The test was not, and never has been, whether the doors of opportunity are cracked a bit wider for a few. It was whether our economic system provides a fair shot for the many for the black custodian and the white steel worker. the immigrant dishwasher and the Native American veteran. To win that battle, to answer that call, this remains our great unfinished business. We shouldn't fool ourselves. The task will not be easy. Since 1963, the economy has changed. The twin forces of technology and global. Competition have subtracted those jobs that once provided a foothold into the middle class reduced. The bargaining power of American workers. And our politics has suffered. Entrenched interests. Those who benefit from an unjust status quo, resisted any government efforts to give working families a fair deal. Marshalling an army of lobbyists and opinion makers to argue that minimum wage increases or stronger labor laws or taxes on the wealthy who could afford it just to fund crumbling schools. That all these things violated sound economic principles. We'd be told that growing inequality was a price for a growing economy, a measure of this free market. That greed was good and compassion ineffective, and those without jobs or health care had only themselves to blame. And then, there were those elected officials who found it useful to practice the old politics of division. Doing their best to convince middle-class Americans of a great untruth, that government was somehow itself to blame for their growing economic insecurity. That distant bureaucrats were taking their hard-earned dollars to benefit the welfare cheat or the illegal immigrant. And then, if we're honest with ourselves, we'll admit that during the course of 50 years, there were times when some of us claiming to push for change lost our way. The anguish of assassination set off self-defeating riots. Legitimate grievances against police brutality tipped into excuse-making for criminal behavior. Racial politics could cut both ways. As the transformative message of unity and brotherhood was drowned out by the language of recrimination. And what had once been a call for equality of opportunity, the chance for all Americans to work hard and get ahead. Was too often framed as a mere desire for government support, as if we had no agency in our own liberation. As if poverty was an excuse for not raising your child, and the bigotry of others was reason to give up on yourself. All of that history is how progress stalled. That's how hope was diverted. It's how our country remained divided. But the good news is, just as was true in 1963, we now have a choice. We can continue down our current path, in which the gears of this great democracy grind to a halt, and our children accept a life of lower expectations, where politics is a zero-sum game where a few do vary. Well, while struggling families of every race fight over a shrinking economic pie, that's one path. Or we can have the courage to change. The March on Washington teaches us that we are not trapped by the mistakes of history. That we are masters of our fate. But it also teaches us that the promise of this nation will only be kept when we work together. We'll have to reignite the embers of empathy and fellow feeling. The coalition of conscience that found expression in this place 50 years ago.